Good evening, fight fans. Welcome to the first video edition of some content from combatpress.com. Tonight we're going to be talking about UFC 177 coming up this weekend from Sleep Train Arena in Sacramento, California. I'm your host, Eric Reinert, staff writer for combatpress.com. And tonight I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Riley Contek. Riley, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, man. How you doing today?
Good. Thanks for joining in.
No problem, man.
Well, like I said, we're going to talk about UFC 177. You know, maybe not the most exciting card on paper that the UFC has put out in recent memory, and certainly pales in comparison to, say, UFC 178. So, before we get into the fights themselves, Riley, let me ask: are you going to buy this one, or are you going to go to a sports bar to watch it?
I'm going to the bar that's 5 minutes down from my house. It is always free. And if I'm not writing that night, that's where you got to be. Free at UFC, I'm there every time. 5
minutes away, that means you can, have a couple cocktails, get yourself home on your feet, not a bad night, right?
Yeah, it works for me, man. It's always good.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna try purchasing this one. I kind of take almost a contrarian view of stuff like this because, sure, I'll buy the really exciting ones, but for ones that I know that not a lot of other people are going to buy, for some reason I find myself sort of feeling bad for the UFC. And I know that's really stupid because they're a billion-dollar company and I'm just a guy. But, like UFC 174 when it was headlined with Johnson and Bagautinov, I felt compelled to buy it just because I didn't think very many other people were going to. And I kind of feel the same about UFC 177. So I'll probably find myself on the couch on Saturday night for that one. We'll see.
As long as you got a six-pack, I think that'll be all right, I guess.
I think for UFC 177, it may require more than a six-pack.
Yeah, maybe a fifth or two.
Getting to the fights themselves, let's talk about what we have on the main card here. I guess, the best we can hope for, I think, Riley, is that we're going to see sort of some surprises on Saturday night. The expectations for the card certainly couldn't be much lower. So, it would be great to see some of these guys and women in one case really come through with a good show. So that's sort of what I've got my fingers crossed for. The first one on the card is going to be a lightweight fight between Yancy Medeiros and Damon Jackson. Medeiros 9-2 overall. 0-2 in the UFC. He's got one no contest as well. Right. Damon Jackson coming in undefeated, but debuting in the UFC on fairly short notice after Justin Edwards had to take a leave of absence after an injury. So, Riley, break this one down for me.
I like this fight, actually. I think if Damon Jackson had more time, I think this would be a dominant win for him. I know he's fighting up a weight class on about, 9 days' notice or something like that. But he's a really, really good wrestler, and I think the only way to beat Medeiros in this case, as Jim Miller showed, is you got to wrestle him and you got to put him where he's uncomfortable. Medeiros is a striker first and foremost, and he's going to be a lot bigger than Jackson. Remember, this is a guy that used to be over 200 pounds before he started slimming down, and in Strikeforce he fought at light heavyweight. So, I mean, this guy is not a small lightweight by any stretch of the imagination. In my opinion, though, Jackson's wrestling and his submission game are way better than Medeiros. Medeiros definitely does have a puncher's chance, and he is definitely superior on the feet, but I think the wrestling of Damon Jackson is just going to be way too good.
I agree that this fight is a surprisingly good matchup, and as I was kind of researching it for our show tonight, I found myself kind of excited for it because, as you pointed out, Damon Jackson's got a hell of a ground game, and Medeiros has shown that he is certainly a threat on his feet. He's got 7 of his 9 wins by he's got 7 of 9 wins by stoppage, 6 by knockout or technical knockout. Right. And he has struggled in the octagon, but he lost by injury to Rustam Khabilov, and then he did beat Yves Edwards before getting popped for weed, and then that became his one no contest. And then of course losing to Jim Miller is certainly nothing to be ashamed of because he's one of the better lightweights of his generation. So I think this will be an interesting test for him to see if he truly belongs in the UFC because he's certainly shown a lot of potential, as you said. Obviously, Jackson is a real brave guy taking this fight on as short a notice as he is. And if he gets this one to the ground, Riley, I think you're absolutely right that this one is his to win. One would hope, though, that Medeiros has been, is prepared for that level of fighting, so to speak, and is prepared to keep it on the feet. And if he's able to do that, rather, I think that he is going to, the experience that he has fighting for the bigger promotions, I think is going to show on Saturday night. So with that being said, I'm actually predicting Medeiros just because I think Jackson, despite his excellent wrestling, could have trouble against the more experienced Medeiros. But Riley, like you said, this one is a surprisingly good fight. And maybe it's not one that on paper belongs on a pay-per-view card, but but certainly one that could end up kind of being a sleeper of a fight.
Something I do want to mention. Something I want to mention before that we move on. We don't know how great Yancy Medeiros' gas tank is either. Again, this is a guy that cuts a lot of weight, and Damon Jackson is a very in shape guy. Most of his wins, I shouldn't say most, all of his wins are by stoppage. But he also has a good gas tank, and it's probably better than Medeiros. And plus, the fact that Jackson's not cutting 10 extra pounds to make lightweight is going to be even better for his cardio going down the stretch. That's why I think he's got such an advantage. If he can weather the early storm, I think he's got a very good chance of winning this fight.
Let me ask you this: if Jackson is able to stop Medeiros, like especially in very convincing fashion, where do you think that puts him? Probably not in the championship mix or even in the contenders mix, but where do you think that places him in the lightweight division, particularly given the short notice before this fight against Medeiros?
Well, I expect him to drop to featherweight after this fight. I don't know if you know this. He's the Legacy FC featherweight champion. He beat Leonard Garcia not long ago for the title. He actually, in very, very dominant fashion, he choked him out in under, 3 minutes. I expect him to drop immediately, and he is one of the top 5 featherweight prospects I had outside the UFC. I think he's got a really, really good chance of making a splash at 145, given his wrestling and his submission ability. He's not a guy that's going to lay on you for 15 minutes. He's going to choke you out, and he's going to do it fast. So, given the amount of wrestlers that the featherweight division has, he's definitely, until he improves his striking, he's going to be a middle-of-the-game guy, but he's got all the potential and all the raw skill to be a guy that's in the top 15 in the next year and a half.
Who'd have thought we would get this much conversation out of Yancy Medeiros versus Damon Jackson? That's what I love about MMA.
I'm a prospects guy. I love
There
Damon.
You go. So I appreciate having an extra voice on this because otherwise I'd just be like, he's new and I don't know if he's going to win. So definitely appreciate the additional insight there, Riley. Let's
I
move
watch
on.
too much MMA, if you couldn't tell.
Anybody who's watching this video watches too much MMA. Believe
That's a good point. There's probably about 7 people watching.
I think that would be a liberal estimate.
It would be very liberal.
Yeah. Next on the card, we've got Ramsey Nijum taking on Carlos Diego Ferreira. Nijum 9-4, 5-3 in the UFC against Ferreira, who's undefeated at 10-0. Very impressive in his UFC debut, submitting Colton Smith in something like 38 seconds.
Yeah.
Definitely made himself a nice splash. I'm still not really sure what to think of Ramsey Nijum because he kind of goes back and forth between success and hard times. He won his last 2. I think this will be a great test, especially against an undefeated guy like Ferreira, who has proven that he is a dangerous commodity in the UFC, to see if he's actually ready to step up because he's only 25, 26 years old.
Yeah, he's still pretty young.
Yeah, still kind of coming into his own. Really hasn't even reached his athletic prime. Obviously I mentioned Ferreira with the impressive UFC debut. I don't necessarily like this matchup on paper because that Ferreira is probably going to be going for the takedown the whole time, and Nijum is going to probably try to stop him the whole time. And Nijum isn't exactly known as a guy with a lot of power in his hands. He did win his last fight by TKO, but that's kind of a rarity for him. So I actually look for this one, probably go the distance. I do predict Ferreira is going to get some control on the ground and kind of outpoint Nijum en route to a decision. But I don't know that this is necessarily going to be the most explosive fight on the card. Riley.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. The fight that I point to was Ramsey Nijum versus James Vick, if you remember that fight. Vick choked him out in under a minute. Vick's a good fighter. He's very underrated. You saw him win last week against Valmir Lazaro.
Yep.
I think that Carlos Diego Ferreira, again, not to harp on this, but he was another guy that was in my top 5 before the UFC came in, top 5 lightweight prospect. He has a really, really good jiu-jitsu, really, really good submissions. And as you saw with Colton Smith, under 40 seconds. Not that I'm saying Colton Smith's a world beater. I think it's anything but that. He won like the weakest season of the Ultimate Fighter, and he was like 3-2 entering the UFC.
Still a professional fighter.
Whatever. But But you know what? He does have underrated takedowns, and although Nijim's really really good wrestler, if Ferreira sets it up with his hands like he did against Smith, I don't know if he set it up with a couple of nice jabs before he went in and got Smith and then took his back that quickly. Nijim again has a puncher's chance. You were saying he doesn't have a lot of power. I think he's got a decent amount of power. He's a strong guy for 155.
He's not known for his power.
Yeah, he's not one-punch knockout power, but if he hits you, he's going to follow up quickly because he's got that killer instinct.
Yep.
So that's what Fajeda needs to really, really be aware of. His striking has come along a little bit. He's not going to be confused with Melvin Manhoff anytime soon. But he uses it to set up things, and if he gets in the clinch, that's where he's going to be successful. Nijim's good in the clinch as well with his dirty boxing. But I think that Fajeda, if he gets him in the clinch, has the transition ability to find a way for Nijim to make a mistake on his own, and he'll capitalize on that mistake. And seeing how good Fajeda is with his submissions, I actually think he will choke him out. If you check out the Bleacher Report main card predictions that I'm putting out later this week for the staff, I have Fajeda winning by a first-round submission. I think that he has the ability, especially if he gets Ramsey's back, because he has really good back control to choke him out in a round.
Should be a good contest.
Should be interesting.
Next, we've got one that's, we're obviously unbiased in our quote-unquote journalistic ways. But, we have to mention that, full disclosure, one of the competitors in the next fight we're going to talk about, Shayna Baszler, is a part-time contributor to the Combat Press. You guys should go check out her piece at combatpress.com talking about her journey to the UFC because, as we all know, Saturday will be her official professional debut in the UFC, not counting her stint on The Ultimate Fighter. Of course, she's taking on Besh Correa, somebody who has made it her stated mission to take out all four members of the so-called Four Horsewomen. Obviously, Correa is undefeated 8-0, 2-0 in the UFC, though neither win has been particularly impressive. Baszler 15-8, again making her official UFC debut. She's definitely taken on the higher caliber of competition, obviously being a pioneer of women's MMA. Let's talk about Correa, undefeated, versus Baszler, kind of a more seasoned, gritty veteran. Riley, who do you think has the advantage with that being said?
Definitely Baszler. Baszler's much bigger. Physical strength is not how big you are. So I think Correa is not going to be at a huge disadvantage strength-wise, but Baszler is definitely bigger, and moving a bigger body around, no matter how strong they are, is more difficult. Correa is a natural 125er. Before she came to the UFC, she actually fought at 125 in Brazil. But like you said it best, she hasn't really been setting the world ablaze with her skills. In my opinion, she lost to Julie Kedzie in Australia. It was a very close fight, but I think that Julie edged her out. And then that fight against Jessamine Duke, she beat her. But, I love Jessamine Duke. I've talked to her plenty of times in doing the Ultimate Fighter blog with her for Bleacher Report. But, she wasn't ready for the UFC. She's a good prospect, but she just definitely wasn't ready. And Correa was just better. She outstruck a girl that used to fight at 145, and she's 125. So I'm still waiting for Correa to actually put on a performance that we can say, wow, Sean Shelby did the correct thing in signing her, because at this point, I know she has 2 wins in the UFC. I think she should be developing her skills in Invicta for a little bit. But yeah, Baszler, the experience and the size is going to be a big deal here.
I think this one's almost definitely going to the ground because Baszler has that tremendous grappling advantage, and I think she's got 15 wins. I want to say 14 are by submission. So, right. She's definitely not shy about that part of her game, and I don't.
She's also been tapped out plenty of times, though, too. I believe she's been submitted 7 times, or
correct,
like 5 or 7 times. So she's beatable on the ground too.
Correct. Though Correa does not have any professional wins by submission,
True.
I don't think. So
we have striker.
She, while every MMA fighter possesses some element of danger on the ground, we haven't seen that be an imminent threat to Correa's opponents. Whereas
she's a striker for sure.
Yeah, Baszler has definitely demonstrated her prowess in catch wrestling. So I think with that being said, and with everything that you said, Riley, about the size advantage that Baszler is going to have coming into the fight, I think that this one's definitely hers to lose. And I predict that she's going to take it to the ground and pull out a submission victory.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
Co-main event, kind of co-main event by default, unfortunately. I feel bad for these two guys because obviously Tony Ferguson and Danny Castillo have had some decent UFC careers. Tony Ferguson's 5-1 in the UFC. Castillo 7-3 with some decent wins on his ledger. Oh, and some definitely setback losses as well. And I think that this fight would be a decent first fight on the pay-per-view or second fight on pay-per-view, but for this to be the co-main event, it really puts the card as a whole at a disadvantage, and I feel like these guys are being unfairly made an example of just because they're being called out in some respect for not quote-unquote deserving the co-main event shot. And I mean, I wrote that very thing basically.
Same here.
For Combat Press, and it's certainly not meant to disrespect them as fighters, but we're talking about the difference between a free card and a $55 card, and I don't know if Tony Ferguson and Danny Castillo are $55 co-main event fighters yet. No. Perhaps after this one, they could prove their place there. So, like I said, Tony Ferguson 5-1 in the UFC, Danny Castillo 7-3. Riley, talk about who you like in this fight and where the winner could find himself among his fellow lightweights, given their previous success.
Yeah, I think you said it best. I think this is actually a really good fight. Like you said, it's not a co-main event of a pay-per-view.
Right.
And that's not their fault. They're taking a lot of crap for no reason. It's not like they put themselves in the co-main event.
Right.
I love this matchup. I think that Danny Castillo is criminally underrated. If you remember his fight against Edson Barboza, he almost knocked him out in the first round. He had him on his heels. I think Tony Ferguson is very good. The reason you don't hear about him as much is because he took over a year off because of injuries, and before that he was on his way to doing awesome things. He was beating guys left and right, and he's a very, very well-rounded guy as well. He's got really good boxing and he's got really good wrestling. So you're looking at two guys with good boxing and good wrestling. So who's gonna win what? I think Castillo's a better wrestler, and I think Ferguson's a better boxer. So it's gonna be who imposes their will. Yeah. And a lot of times wrestling takes care of that, especially with a guy like Castillo who can really put you up against the fence and make you uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think this one probably stays on its feet just because, like you said, Castillo is a wrestler, but he has shown that he does have a lot of striking prowess, like you said, in his fight against Edson Barboza. So, and Ferguson's certainly not much of a grappler, at least not having demonstrated that in the win-loss column. So I think this one remains standing, and I like Ferguson in this one. Honestly, he's had that underrated success in the UFC at 5-1. Like you said, that year off probably hurt his prospects a little bit. The thing I think that the key differentiator here for me is that Danny Castillo has had a reasonably long career, and he's 35 years old, and that's. I think by any stretch of the I don't want to say stretch of the imagination, you could say that that's probably past their prime in almost every division except maybe heavyweight.
Randy Couture?
Yeah, exactly. Dan Henderson, and I suppose if you can find the right quote unquote training enhancement, you can enhance your career as long as you need to. But,
right, Vitor.
Right. But neither of these fighters having developed a reputation for doing that, we have to assume that they're both fighting clean. And that being said, Castillo being 35, that's kind of on the wrong side of his prime. And I think Ferguson, he's going to come out and he's going to put on a show because, like we said, I think these guys have taken a lot of heat unfairly, and they're definitely both out to prove that maybe they're never going to be able to prove that they belong in this co-main event spot, but as long as they're here, I hope that their mentality is we need to put on as good a show as we possibly can. And
no doubt.
Ferguson having had that consistent success, obviously minus the loss to Michael Johnson, I think he's going to show that he is a force to be reckoned with at lightweight. And, at 30, he's still got maybe 1 or 2 more years to advance his way up the ranks. So I like Ferguson in this one, probably by decision.
I'm going to take Castillo. He's fighting in front of his hometown, even though Ferguson is from California. But I just think his wrestling is like I said, him as a fighter is criminally underrated, but his wrestling is really, really good. And I like how he's looked. He's been a little inconsistent in the octagon, but I just think that it's his time right now. He's going to accept this co-main event in his hometown, and I think that he's going to incorporate his game plan. And, he's working out with some really good training partners. He always does. Ferguson fights with Knuckleheads Boxing and a couple other places, and I'm sure he differentiates his training. But I don't know. I just got a hunch that Castillo's going to take this one, so I will Respectfully disagree with you.
I will respectfully accept your disagreement.
Awesome.
TJ Dillashaw is going to try to defend his bantamweight title in the main event of UFC 177, really the main marketable fight, the only one that's on the poster, for example, against former champion, the man who he took the belt from at UFC 173. Of course, I'm talking about Renan Burrell. First, let me ask you this, Riley. Is this the hardest rematch or the hardest title fight to predict in recent memory?
Title rematch?
Just title, because like the
or
reason
title
I
fight
ask,
in general.
Yeah, the reason I ask is when I was doing my research for this fight, I honestly, I'll share my prediction, and I'll share why in a little while. But I found myself a little bit torn because, on one hand you've got Dillashaw, who was a huge underdog and not only beat Renan Burrell, but beat him pretty soundly. But on the other hand, you've got Renan Burrell. Who's Renan Burrell? And has displayed this sort of immense talent and success that you don't see very often in the UFC. So that's why I had trouble picking this one. So let's hear from you.
Yeah, no, I definitely did too. I was going back and forth all week, last week. It's a tough call. You're right. Dillashaw completely destroyed him in the first fight. I remember watching it. I was laying in bed watching it on my laptop, and I was just like, I might just go to sleep, man. I'm done. And I was like, you know what? I'll watch the first round if it's competitive. I know Burrell's a slow starter,
Sure.
but I'll watch it and see what happens. And Dillashaw creamed him in the first round. I thought he was going to finish him in the first round, and I was going crazy. Actually, I'm not usually too, unless I've had a few to drink. I'm not usually too outward with my celebrations and stuff. And I stuck around for that fight. You're right. This is definitely one of the tougher title fights to pick in recent memory. I can't think of one off the top of my head that I was debating so back and forth on. It was probably Benson Henderson, Anthony Pettis too, where I was kind of didn't know who to take.
Yeah,
I know that was a while ago, but so I mean I'm going to go with Dillashaw in this fight.
Okay.
I actually think that he's hitting a stride in his career. I mean, guys were talking about 3-4 years ago, this guy's going to be a champion someday, and a lot of people say that about their teammates and stuff, and you kind of just brush it off. But when it comes true like that, I think that people see something, and that means that the person's a hard worker. You're not going to say that about someone who's lazy. You're not going to be like, this guy's going to be a champion in 4 years, except he only comes to the gym twice a week. Dillashaw is a gym rat, and he's working with Dwayne Ludwig, who, in my opinion, has become, if not the best coach in MMA, one of the top 3 coaches in MMA. That's just my personal opinion. Things he did with Team Alpha Male. Now he's going to be opening his own gym. But again, Burrell, maybe he had an off night. I don't know. Sometimes I didn't always perform my best when I was in sports. I'd have an off night here and there. So maybe he just had an off night. I don't know. And remember, even he said, and this might just be an excuse, that first knockdown, he said rung his bell. He says he doesn't remember the rest of the fight. I think that's an excuse, but it's possible. It looked like he was going to be knocked out. So you never know. And Burrell might come back. He's always a slow starter, too, and I mentioned that before. So if he starts slow, that's not going to. He has to start fast because Dillashaw is going to get in his face from the get-go.
You raise a very great point that, exactly what you just said. Dillashaw has found the recipe for success against Renan Burrell because he demonstrated that success at UFC 173 when he put Burrell on his ass and stole his belt from him. And with, I think Burrell remembers that. And that's why I'm actually picking him to win this fight, is because I think that he's not going to be dumb enough to stand in front of TJ Dillashaw. The majority of Renan Burrell's wins have been by submission. And so I think, I'm sure Dillashaw's got some great grappling with Team Alpha Male and, Uriah Faber being one of the sport's better grapplers. But, I think Renan Burrell has, like I said, has demonstrated the sort of talent that's very difficult to pick against. I think he's going to try to put TJ Dillashaw on his back as soon as possible and try to submit him as soon as possible, because the last thing he wants is to have another situation where he gets rocked in the first round and ends up getting pounded, and then everybody says, oh, Renan Burrell, who's that? Even though he, won the title, I guess the interim title, and then defended it, a handful of times and seemed like such a dominant wrecking machine. So, if he game plans correctly for Dillashaw, I think that the night is going to go in his favor. But all it takes, like we saw at UFC 173, like you said, is Dillashaw getting in his face quick enough, avoiding the takedown, and putting his hands on his chin. And if that happens, I think we're going to see a repeat of what happened over Memorial Day weekend. But
well, you bring up that Burrell has got to take him down. Can he take down Dillashaw? Dillashaw is a great wrestler, and he's very quick on his feet. And as you see, his footwork has gotten worlds better. So Burrell is going to have to really be crafty when shooting for takedowns because that will not be easy.
I 100% agree, and perhaps I'm inflating the talent of Renan Burrell. I just remember the way he buzzed through the rest of the UFC's bantamweight division, including the aforementioned Uriah Faber a couple of times. Made him look like he wasn't even in his class.
Right.
So, you know, I'm just remembering how easy he made it look, and you know, it's not like he's past his prime, but who knows? You know, maybe that the loss to Dillashaw over Memorial Day weekend really shook him, and you know, we don't know what that sort of loss does to people's confidence because you know it affects everybody on an individual basis. So he'll need to prove that he can rebound from a loss because obviously he had all of that success leading up to the fight with Dillashaw, not just in the UFC, but pretty much every fight that he had except for his first one before the UFC.
Right,
So,
and I think Dillashaw got his game plan from Eddie Wineland because if you remember the Wineland-Burrell fight, I think Wineland won that first round, to be honest with you. And I think that's the key. I think Wineland was the guy that exposed Burrell. You need to get in his face early and often. You can't let him get going. Once he gets comfortable, you're not going to beat him. And Dillashaw didn't let him get comfortable.
I think it's a good sign that despite kind of the weak on-paper nature of this card, we've still got a couple of fights that are sort of tough to call, or at least that we're respectfully disagreeing with each other about. So I think that's a sign of a decent card. Riley, final thoughts. What's the best case scenario for UFC 177?
Best case scenario, all 5 fights are firefights. People call their friends after the first fight and say, dude, you should see these fights, kind of like that happened with Ultimate Fighter 1. Best case scenario, this pay-per-view does 200,000 sells.
Yeah.
That's the best case scenario. I don't see a lot of people buying this. Like I said, the only reason I would buy it is if I had like 10, 15 friends come over and we all pitched.
Sure.
And then I used that $5 off coupon they sent me in the email. And then I would buy it probably. And I'd probably get it in low definition anyways, so it'd be $10 cheaper. The worst case scenario, it does under 100,000, making it the worst selling pay-per-view in possibly history of the UFC. I don't have the numbers there, but I think every pay-per-view's done over 100,000. And who's to blame? And then the UFC be like, well, what happened? And it's like, well, you didn't give us a pay-per-view quality card. So that'd be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think that the UFC is already prepared to kind of write this one off from a buy rate perspective, and I guess it's a good sign that they're loading up UFC 178 because maybe they'll recoup some of the expenses that maybe they lost for UFC 177. Is Johnson Carriazo the most attractive headliner in the world? Not really, but the other 4 fights on the card are freaking awesome. So,
yeah. And by the way, if Johnson Carriazo was on this card like it was supposed to be, this was a must-buy because I think those 2 top fights were dynamite. I mean, the Carriazo in the co-main event, not as attractive, but I mean, just to see Demetrius Johnson do his thing, I'm cool with that.
I could not agree with you more. In fact, at a previous website that we wrote for, I wrote a piece very much arguing in favor of that point because I love Demetrius Johnson. I don't really care who he's fighting.
Right.
Okay, UFC 177 is live on, let's see, I think there's a Fight Pass fight at like 4:30 Central Time.
Yep.
And then prelims start at, let's see, 8 Eastern, Fox Sports 1. And then main card starts at 10 Eastern on pay-per-view, again, coming to us from Sleep Train Arena in Sacramento. Riley, thanks so much for joining in tonight. Really appreciate you coming in on the first edition of the Combat Press preview show. Follow Riley at Big Riles. Hold up the sign.
Yeah, you got
it. Big Riles MMA on Twitter. Follow my man Riley Contact.
Yeah, you can see the budget I'm working with over here.
Of course, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Reinert Eric, and of course, follow all of our friends at Combat Press. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. This has been the UFC 177 preview show. I'm Eric Reiner for Riley Contact. Take care and enjoy the fights.